Welcome YouTube to another D&D Fridays. Today we'll be looking at just some of the pros and cons and benefits to small parties versus large parties and everything in between, just to take a look and maybe help out in any decision making on what group size might fit you from a player or a GM perspective. But before we head into that, let's not forget, hit that notification bell, subscribe, and let us know in the comments below what's your preferred group size and maybe why you might like it or not like it. Without further ado, let's get into it.
All right.
So, a lot of times when we look into D&D, we usually see groups of players, usually between 3 and 7, which are probably most of the time. And it seems like 4 to 5 seems to be about the average for a group. And there's definitely a lot of good and bad, I think, to each group size. When it comes to a small group, usually it's about 3 players, give or take, one. Maybe seeing 2 players, but generally not below that. When it comes to that, I think one of the pros is you can really get a lot of. You can meet quite often, as scheduling isn't usually a problem, as you only have like 3 or 4 people to worry about, including the GM. So it's
Yep.
usually easy to find time to meet at some point during the week. And then the other pro, I think, or other benefit is really once you actually get into the campaign, whether it's combat, RPing, or whatnot, the pacing is generally pretty good, as you only have a small handful of people really discussing things, making decisions, stuff like that. So it's more along the lines of have 3 people, all right, pretty quick to say let's go shopping or let's go investigate this dungeon or whatever it may be. Pretty easy. Combat turns are pretty quick and everything. So I think that's another pro to having a small group as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with your points that it allows for a more intimate setting, allows you to get together more often, and maybe it allows you to get through the campaign a little bit quicker because you're meeting more often. Um, I personally like the idea of smaller groups. I think they're easier to manage, easier to get to know the people, and have fun like that. I do want to expound on the idea of a small group, though. I think there are those cases, those scenarios where 1 or 2 person campaigns make sense. I've heard of cases where a dad and their son or daughter are doing a D&D campaign, and the dad's the DM, and the son or daughter is just playing, and so it's basically a 2 person campaign. And I think those are really, for those that want to bring their young ones into the game, I think those are perfect small groups, right? Because it's a one-on-one sort of scenario, and you can coach and give feedback right there with that person. So I just wanted to make sure that we covered that also, because I think that's a benefit of a small group too.
Yep, exactly. Um, and and I think that's not just with one person, but also maybe like 2 or 3 as well. You can really have, like you said, that intimate setting as well.
True.
Um, and it's a lot of times it's usually among like family members or really close friends, that sort of thing. Um, and it can be really fun depending on how things go.
Yeah.
On the flip side of things, though, I think a really big con to that, though, is if 1 or 2 of those players can't make a night, then you're more than likely going to have to cancel that night because
Yeah.
you just don't have enough people to make a meaningful session unless it's just going to be like a shopping session or something like that.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
that's definitely something to keep in mind. Um, but sometimes life does happen, um, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
And I think one of the other big cons is you is more so for the GM. You really have to understand your balancing because
Mhm.
with only like 2 or 3 people, they're not gonna have every party role filled or whatnot. So you have to really weigh your RP, your exploration, your combat pillars, and just figure out what can 2 or 3 people handle because they don't have a tank, a healer, or a ranged DPS.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? They all might be 3 really weak wizards in this campaign, and they don't, and you don't want to throw major melee enemies at them because it's just going to wipe them out. So I think that's a really good point. Is the DM/GM needs to make sure that they're very cognizant of the balance issues when it comes to smaller parties.
Yeah, and not saying that small parties never have a good balance. It's just when you have 5, 6, 7 players, it's much easier to have a balanced party with that many players.
Yep, exactly.
Definitely something to keep in mind, more so for the GMDM point of view.
Yep, definitely do.
And then when we get to the large parties, 6, 7 or so players, you really see the pros and cons kind of flip. So it's pretty hard to schedule because now you have like 7, 8, 9 people. You have to figure out what's everybody's schedule like. Because then you have a higher chance of people having family, kids they got to worry about, work, whatever it may be. So it's going to be very difficult to really have any consistent meet-in time. And but on the flip side of things, if like 1 or 2 people can't make it, it's pretty easy to move on, unless there's like a big bad boss that you planned, like the big BBEG or something like that. But other than that, it's pretty easy to just say, yeah, so Bill here, he's pretty much just like doing a little bit of shopping in the town for this session, or he's staying back to make sure the camp is fine, or whatever it is for that session. So it's pretty easy to do that. Or have somebody play that character if they're alright with it.
Yep.
Although one thing that I think is probably a con for a large party is the more people you have, the greater the chance that there's going to be some sort of like inter-party conflict. If it's just among their player characters, it's not as big of a deal. That might just be the personalities and stuff. You can roll with that depending on what it is. But inter-party conflict in terms of the players themselves, as there's more different types of personalities, characters, stuff like that. So that's something you definitely have to worry about. And I think that's something that you have to really think about when you're choosing your players for a large group is, would these players really get along with each other? Although it's hard to really judge that all the time before starting play. Sometimes things come up like halfway through a campaign or something like that. So that's definitely something to really keep in mind. And if something like that does really crop up, it's really up to the GM to say, all right, I need to squash this. Let's figure out how we squash this. And
Yeah.
that's different from person to person, group to group.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. You gotta be really cognizant of the different personalities. I do think that with a larger group, though, to that when you have a bunch of disparate personalities, it also opens up the possibility of having a really interesting and fun time, because there could be some crazy harebrained idea that gets thrown out, or somebody's going to do some, the dice rolls perfectly for 2 or 3 players, and it just causes this awesome experience because there's more dice being thrown because there's more players. So I think it's sort of a double-edged sword there, to your point, right? It could go either way. You could run into personality issues, or you could just have these awesome, stories that come out of it because there's so many people there and you're throwing all of these dice. So I think you've just got to be careful and got to be cognizant as the DMGM to make sure that if those issues come up, that you are squashing them and being cognizant of that. And again, it's going to be a lot more energy doing that when there's 7, 8 people at the table versus 3 or 4.
Yeah, yeah, and I really agree with a lot of what you said, and that actually gave me an idea of when you have that many players, you as a GM really have to keep this in mind in terms of players are going to do what you least expect. And when there's like 6, 7, 8 brains against your one, there's going to be a lot higher chance that they're going to come up with something or another to get around that encounter that you threw at them, or that puzzle, or whatever. So you're definitely going to have to keep that in mind, and definitely not be like rigid with anything like that or whatnot. You have to keep in mind there's 7 of them. They're probably going to come up with something.
Yeah, exactly. You just gotta accept the fact that your encounter's probably gonna go down the tubes the way that you planned it.
Yep. Because at that point, you're just going to be there for the ride.
Yeah. I also think that having a large group, there's another con with people potentially getting bored when people, it takes a long time to go around the table, and you might have people that start pulling out their phones, or dozing off maybe, or looking out into space and spacing off there a little bit. But so that, I think that's another con, because when it's just a small group, it's a little bit easier to keep everybody kind of the pace moving and everybody involved. But when it's a large group and you somehow get off on a one person tangent on the story, and even if you just spend a half an hour with that person, focus on that one person, there are 6, 7 other people at that table that are literally doing nothing. Like, some of them might be interested because the story and the RP is really good, but you also got to make sure that when you're dealing with large groups, that you're keeping that in mind. You want to keep the pace moving. You want to keep people involved so that they stay interacting.
Yeah, exactly. And especially with the large group, that's probably going to happen at some point in terms of like the split the party syndrome or something like that. And you just have to be aware of, when that happens, how long do I let this go before I reel it back in? And that's going to be different from situation to situation.
Sure.
Yeah, and when it comes to like, especially combat with 7 people, that is going to take a while, especially if there's multiple full casters in the party.
Yeah.
So I think in those situations, I think it's good to really implement the system of, all right, because there's so many people here, you got to keep the decision making and everybody's turn to a minimum. Like, I'm going to give everybody like a minute to think about what they want to do, and after that, you got to execute it. If not, you're just going to take the dodge action or whatever it may be.
Right. Exactly. Make sure those ground rules are laid out and everybody understands them, and they're following them for sure.
Yeah. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Me personally, I kind of like a medium style group. Usually about 5 people, maybe 4, because I think that brings in the best of both worlds, but doesn't bring in too many of the negatives from both. So with like 4 or 5 people, you have a good chance of having a lot of the party roles. You have just enough people where you don't have to worry as much about balancing and all that type of stuff, but you don't have enough people to worry about scheduling as much. You still have to worry about it as with every group, but it's not as big of a deal as with 7 people. So it's really in that middle ground type of thing. Of course, with all of this stuff, it can lean either which way depending on who's actually playing at the table, though.
Yeah.
As with everything.
Very true. I think for me, I'd probably lean more towards a 3 or 4 person table, because I like the more intimate settings. I like making sure everybody's involved a little bit more. That is me. So I'm on the low side of the medium, but I think to this point, I think that's why on average most games are 5 people, right? 4, 5, 6 people, is because everybody thinks that that's sort of the optimum number of people from a group perspective. And then as a side benefit, you sort of fill all of those traditional roles at a table that you want to have in an RPG game, right? I'm personally a little bit more flexible with not having all of the roles. Like, I think that's kind of a neat little twist, and I would be okay not having a traditional role filled. But again, that's personal preference on my part.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to the party roles, that's probably something to have a good talk with everybody at the start. It's like, yeah, just to give y'all a heads up, there's not going to be a tank in the party.
Right.
We'll let that be. We'll let the dice fall as they will.
Yeah, exactly. So for a question from me to you, as you being the experienced GM here, have you ever had the thought to run a one shot of like 12, 13, 14 people and see how that goes? I think if you were to do anything but a one shot, you're a lunatic, but if that's something that you'd want to do.
So, I never thought about doing a one shot for like 12, 14 people because I think that would be quite difficult in terms of the logistics of how to run that.
Sure.
I think if I was to do something like that, I would need, I would have to have somebody helping me as like a co-DM or something like that, where I could say, all right, I'm going to be like the lead DM. I'm going to be like the final say so on the story and all that stuff, and I'm going to need to have somebody else be like a co-DM. So if I'm dealing with like these four people on something, that other person can say, all right, I'm going to do a quick like 10-minute thing with the rest of the party so they're not bored out of their minds or whatever it may be.
Well, absolutely. I think that's a good point, right? Is if you have that large of a party, you definitely want a co-DM or maybe even a couple of co-DMs.
Yeah. And then for something like that, definitely before we actually sit down and start playing, whether it's like an hour before or whatever, preferably a day before or whatever, I would definitely want to sit down with my co-DM or co-DMs and say, all right, this is the story for the one shot that I have planned. Let's make sure we're all on the same page with what's going on and everything. We know what the end goal is, how to get to that end goal type of thing. And then whatever happens to get to that end goal, we'll each have some autonomy to go about it as long as we can get to somewhere near that end goal, and then we'll just come together as co-DMs and just figure out, yeah, there was a slight mishap here. That may or may not have an effect on what these three players did on their split the party moment or whatever it may be. But for something like that, I think sitting down with your co-DMs before the game is run and just making sure everybody's on the same page with what's going to happen is necessary.
I don't think I was advocating for anybody running a 14-person table, but just it was an interesting thought experiment that popped into my head as we were talking about this. So.
Yeah, and honestly, the first thing that popped into my head while answering that question was really, so in Adventures League, there's this thing called epics, which are these big groups of players that come together, like 15 people, 20 people, whatnot, and they're all playing more or less the same thing. Maybe at like different groups are doing like coming in different entrances or whatnot. So that's kind of like one way of doing it. And maybe like there's like the three store owners or whatever it's at, or like just taking up different posts in the store, and they have like a section of the group that they're over and that type of stuff. So if anybody is interested in really doing something like that, I would definitely recommend reading up in terms of how these Adventure League epics are run, and if any of those rule sets or the way it's done or whatnot is interesting, and you want to adopt something like that, I think that's a good base to at least look at.
That's interesting. I did not know that was a thing in Adventure League, so that's really interesting.
Yeah. Now, of course, if you're doing it for a homebrew, you probably wouldn't be as strict as Adventure League stuff, unless that's your cup of tea. Because Adventures League is pretty. We're doing it. Rules is written stuff just to have everybody on the same page type of deal.
Very by the book.
Yep. But all in all, I think while I personally enjoy medium groups of 4 to 5 players, I at the end of the day I think whether it's a small group, medium group, or large group, I think each group is totally fine for everybody to have fun with, and everybody's going to have their own preferences. So I definitely I definitely recommend everybody to pretty much go in the group size that you're definitely comfortable with. Maybe try out a different group size at some point just to see what that's like. But at the end of the day, I think whatever each individual person is comfortable with, I say go for it.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah.
Right.
And with that said in stone and in the books, we'll see y'all next time on D&D Fridays. And until then, keep y'all's lives geeky.
Bye, everybody.